War is the closest thing to hell on earth. For some Italian women, however, the Second World War was even worse than that. When men unleash their cruelty, they are often equally ruthless on either side. Little is said about the violent treatment endured by Italian women when French troops fought at Monte Cassino. The violence against them was so severe that today this period is referred to as Marocchinate, indicating the mass rapes and killings committed by the soldiers. The term derives from Marocchinades, referring to the Moroccan nationality of many of the aggressors, who were the Goumiers, colonial soldiers of the French Expeditionary Corps who fought in the Battle of Monte Cassino and became notorious for their brutality against women. What horrible abuses did these Italian women endure while the rest of the country celebrated its liberation? Area of hills, cliffs and mountains. Terror in the heights. The Battle of Monte Cassino, also known as the Battle for Rome, was a series of 4 intense confrontations during the Second World War, fought by the Allies with the ultimate goal of liberating the Italian capital, which was then under Nazi control. In this war that lasted 6 long years, the largest global military conflict in history, 2 sides faced off. The Axis powers comprising Germany, the Empire of Japan, and the Kingdom of Italy, and on the other side were the Allies, which included the previously mentioned powers as well as, to a lesser extent, due to their low military power, Poland, China, and France. The latter had an army fighting in Italy and was the protagonist of this scandalous, blood-stained story of torture, rape, and death. The Allied powers were primarily led by Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. These countries were governed by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, respectively. They formally united when they signed the United Nations Declaration on the 1st of January 1942. The Axis powers, in contrast, never developed institutions to coordinate their foreign policy or direct joint military operations, but they nevertheless committed to providing mutual military and political assistance. In early 1944, the western part of the Gustav Line, whose main pivot was located on the steep slopes of Monte Cassino, was held by the Germans, who had positions in the valleys of the Gari, Liri, and Garigliano rivers, and on some nearby peaks and cliffs, though not in the historic Abbey of Monte Cassino. That same year, on the 14th of May, the French army set out to cross terrain in Monte Cassino, located in the Italian province of Frosinone in the Lazio region. Due to the devastation caused in France after years of German occupation, its army in 1944 was partly composed of the so-called Goumiers, the name given to the most extreme Moroccan colonial soldiers. The French advanced, destroying German lines and allowing the English of the 12th British Corps to break through the resistance, giving the Anglo-Saxons a clear path to continue to the next line of defense of the Wehrmacht, Adolf Hitler's formidable German army, which at that point was suffering from relentless demoralization within its ranks, alongside an unspoken retreat in its European advance. The following year, in September of 1945, the global conflict would end with Germany's surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad, considered by many historians to be the turning point that determined the outcome of the war, would be left behind. The Allied forces attacked the Abbey of Monte Cassino with 350 tons of explosives between February and May of 1944. They also carried out air raids on Monte Cassino and the city of Cassino to defeat the Third Reich forces stationed there. General Alphonse Juin, commanding the French troops, congratulated his men on their victory in the battle and gave them freedom of action. This would prove to be a mistake, as some of the most heinous crimes of the entire war occurred in the following hours. It is said that Juin roused his men beforehand, assuring them that if they won the battle, they would have 50 hours as the absolute masters of whatever they found beyond the enemy. He also assured them that no one would penalize them for what they did, nor would they be questioned about their actions. The following night, thousands of Goumiers roamed the mountain slopes, surrounding towns and villages in the region known as Chiociaria. It was the beginning of the nightmare, of the darkness that still casts a shadow of horror over the area to this day. Defenseless civilians were forced to choose between 2 equally terrible options: either face the most horrendous subjugation they could imagine at the hands of the Allied forces, or suffer the ruthless National Socialist fascism on the opposite side. The Goumiers, the reputation of an exceedingly reckless group, The Goumiers, mostly Moroccans, made up the French Expeditionary Corps on the Italian front. This corps also included Algerians, Tunisians, and Senegalese. They were considered irregular French troops and came from the colonies France held in North Africa. The most fundamentalist among them were from Morocco. They knew they were not well regarded for their savage acts and behaved like animals toward their enemies, flaunting their bad reputation. These corps were formally organized into 4 divisions commanded by General Alphonse Juin, a general with extensive military experience who was once a friend of Charles de Gaulle, whom he met at the military academy. Juin was born in French Algeria and fought in both the First and Second World Wars, where he was captured by the Nazis and then collaborated with them. However, not long after, he switched sides again to work for the Allies. The colonial soldiers under Juin's command numbered 7,833, and they wore the characteristic green wool tunic with multicolored bands and rope sandals. They were not dressed for combat, at least not in the sense we understand it in terms of being prepared for war. This was their uniform, their everyday clothing. They carried the jambia, a weapon that evokes mystery and tradition. The jambia is a curved blade dagger, varying in size according to the preference of the bearer, and it is said that they used it to cut the ears and noses off slain enemies to make necklaces. In the town of Cassino, the French army faced the formidable strength of the Germans. Adolf Hitler's forces put up fierce resistance, refusing to relinquish their position. Until that point, the Goumiers had advanced with little difficulty through the Italian peninsula. 3 groups of Goumiers, named the Corps de Montagne, were the vanguard of the French Expeditionary Corps' attack through the Aurunci Mountains during Operation Diadem, the 4th and final Battle of Monte Cassino, which was captured by the Allies on the 18th of May 1944. Despite this, they are not remembered for defeating the Nazi army, but rather for their brutal and inhumane abuses, for the merciless treatment inflicted upon their victims, innocent civilians subjected to their cruel and beastly behavior as they took out their fury on every resident in the area. Regardless of gender or age, all were targets of their most ferocious sexual appetites, horrifyingly aggressive and sadistic. Not content with this, their material greed led them to break into houses and seize anything they deemed valuable. If anyone resisted, it was even worse. All this was done with the endorsement of the French commander, who motivated them to carry out such bloody horror, and with the silence of General de Gaulle, despite knowing about these events and being the highest military authority. The Goumiers were a discredited shock force that commanded no respect. They treated their adversaries and prisoners with extreme brutality, and the Germans were well aware of this. The Third Reich forces, which had partially left the Monte Petrella area defenseless, east of Cassino, knew that only the Moroccan mountain troops could have survived in that region, and they were not mistaken. Knowing what they were capable of, the Germans warned the civilian population of the imminent danger by dropping leaflets from the air, urging them to flee that same May. Despite the imminent terror, not everyone was willing to heed the warning message delivered from the sky by their own enemy, who occupied the country. The only ones who managed to save themselves were many children evacuated by the fascist National Republican Guard. They were sent to colonies in the Rimini area, but the vast majority took refuge on the Poleka Plateau, a territory located below Monte Petrella. However, this was not enough for the well-trained African soldiers accustomed to the mountains, and it did not take them long or much effort to reach these areas. The victims, the silenced voices of horror. The story of Russian soldiers from the Red Army is well known. Toward the end of the war, as they advanced to capture Berlin, they raped any woman who crossed their path, or the equally abhorrent story of Nazi military brothels. Those stories are known, but little is said about these atrocities, as serious or even worse. Perhaps their story is less known because French authorities looked the other way when the accusing finger was pointed at them. The Allies remained silent about it because the soldiers who went rogue and caused this disaster were their own troops, and they could not afford to tarnish their honor. This brutal sexual assault showed no regard for gender or age, and often ended in terrible deaths. Some witnesses reported that the priest of Esperia made the grave mistake of opposing this barbarity when he realized 3 women were about to be attacked. According to them, the assailants retaliated by tying him to a post and repeatedly abusing him throughout the night. Eventually, the priest died from the internal injuries inflicted. The famous Italian neo-realist film director Vittorio De Sica made a film in 1960 titled La Chiocciara, known in English as Two Women. It depicts a brutal event in which a widowed woman and her daughter flee Rome, seeking refuge in the countryside. In an abandoned church where they took shelter for the night, they were attacked and savagely assaulted. The film starred the actress Sophia Loren, who won an award for her performance. The scene of the sexual assault lasts a few minutes, but it is the most dramatic moment of the movie. De Sica is one of the few artists who, through his film, denounces the passage of the Moroccan soldiers through the Italian peninsula, recounting their acts of vandalism. For many, it would have been preferable to die without suffering than to endure such an atrocity. Continuing to live while bearing that burden made daily life impossible, and many wished not to go on, according to reports. Many of the abusers were natives of the French colonies, which is largely why the original French distanced themselves from any responsibility. However, they themselves also participated in abuse and all forms of sexual violence but covered it up, choosing to discredit with a clearly racist attitude the Africans in their ranks, those from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia and Senegal. It would have been easy for them to hide behind the excuse that they were acting under orders from their superior, but they knew that was not sufficient justification. Most acted solely under their own internal conviction and felt no need to offer explanations. The pain of these events, which still lingers in the minds and souls of those who survived, remains immeasurable despite the passage of time. The drama of the Marocchinate outlived the immense tragedy that was the Second World War. The witnesses, the disturbing gaze of the spectators. Many witnesses, both direct and indirect victims of the atrocities committed by the soldiers, remain. The inhabitants of the area still recall with horror some of the scenes they witnessed and experienced firsthand. While many are no longer alive to recount their stories, the accounts of their experiences have been passed down orally from generation to generation, reaching us today and lending credibility to one of the many dark chapters of the terrible Great War. The wounds caused by that excessive attack are far from healing, and those who suffered it cannot forget for a single moment, as reflected in their stories. Many people were forced to abandon their homes because they did not feel safe there. Entire families and groups of people hid together to stay safe, knowing that this was a privilege many did not have. Going out into the streets almost certainly meant facing the consequences. Hidden away, trying to remain safe, they often heard cries for help but could do nothing. Many survivors say they felt a sense of cowardice, but on the other hand, there was little they could do to help their fellow humans. They preferred not to become the next victims and instead protect their loved ones. When night fell, terrible hours began. The cries of young women who had been kidnapped during the day could be heard. It was a cry that found no comfort, chilling the blood of those who had to listen. They also feared that they could be the next to suffer the same violence. Thus, they remained silent, despite the desperate screams they heard. Since then, the Battle of Monte Cassino has become synonymous with terror. The word Marocchinate remains embedded in the popular imagination of this region that lived through the horrors of war firsthand. Entire civilian populations became victims of the Allies, who in theory had come to Italy to liberate them from Nazi occupation and rid them of the brutal fascism of the Axis, led by Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. The French military in the peninsula comprised 130,000 men, including African colonial soldiers. All were tainted by these heinous acts. What happened was far worse than the worst nightmare their victims could have imagined. Perhaps the most terrifying part was the fact that all of this occurred in just one night, the 18th of May, 1944, after the soldiers listened to their leading general. Thousands of Goumiers left their camps to roam through the area encompassing several towns in the Chiocciaria region. Feeling free to do as they pleased without fear of punishment, the most terrifying hell broke loose. It lasted over 50 hours, with no control or resistance. Group violence took hold of them. Everything was terrifying, and the ferocity with which they treated their victims was horrifying. At first, the troops acted selectively, but then they unleashed their full capacity for evil without caring who the target was. Among them, no one stopped the aggression. On the contrary, they encouraged each other, fueling their cynicism and pushing for more. It was as if it were a competition. The scenes were nightmarish, horrific in scale for the damage inflicted, where no adjective adequately describes the abominations experienced. In many cases, even children were chosen as victims of rape, not just adolescents or mature women as would happen later. Even grandmothers, some over 80 years old, were subjected to their most terrifying assaults. In one town in the region, hundreds of Moroccan soldiers arrived and raped 30 women and 2 men in a short time. It all happened so quickly that no one could warn them. There was no salvation or escape for those caught in this disaster. In another locality, 2 sisters were forced to satisfy a platoon of nearly 200 soldiers in a chilling act of unprecedented cruelty and brutality. The suffering inflicted during the assault increased deliberately and unnecessarily. Another truly incomprehensible case involves around 300 combatants who brutally attacked an elderly man, choosing to gang rape him as a means of intimidation. Raping men became a routine act that satisfied their insatiable thirst for monstrosity, and no town in the region was safe from this. Crucified girls and abused priests, the infinite cruelty of the Goumiers. According to records from the period belonging to the National Association of Civilian Victims of War, a parish priest named Don Alberto Terilli confronted the looters, opposing their attack on 2 girls aged 6 and 9. He simply wanted to save them from the abuse they were inevitably about to endure. The soldiers' reaction was immediate, and the priest was brutally assaulted right there in front of the children. In Pico, one of the towns visited by the troops, a girl was crucified in the open alongside her sister while the family was forced to witness the grotesque act. Stories of such savagery abound, where the norm was brutality, extreme sadism, and the most unhinged violence. General de Gaulle, commander-in-chief of the French army, was aware of everything happening in Italy with his troops and did absolutely nothing, neither to prevent it initially nor to seek justice afterward. And General Alphonse Juin, who authorized these atrocities, was never punished by his superiors. The helpless spectators could offer no help to the assaulted person, as they were often forced to watch the horrific spectacle at gunpoint. Over the years, much documentation and testimony have surfaced, allowing a more detailed reconstruction of the unbearable events. Evidence was gathered to piece together this hidden truth with greater accuracy. The general's speech ignited chaos and set the stage for the worst possible scenario. It was confirmed that the perpetrators were soldiers who, upon hearing their superiors' words, unleashed their rage without caring about the damage they were causing. It was an irreparable calamity of unimaginable proportions. The fuse was lit, and anyone who resisted, regardless of their status, would also become a target of their aggression. All the small towns in that region, without exception, were savagely attacked. No one was safe, and the inhabitants had nowhere to go. There was simply no escape from such human calamity. The practice carried out by many involved restraining their victim by the ankles and wrists to immobilize them, then taking turns in line to commit the sexual assault. It was an atrocious and cowardly act carried out by many. In one town in the area, it is said that 4 girls, none older than 15, were forced to sexually satisfy a troop of 100 soldiers for hours. As a result of this attack, one of them died, and another suffered a psychotic breakdown from which she never recovered, spending the rest of her life in an asylum. The other 2 were left severely traumatized, but in addition to these abhorrent acts, they also looted homes and stole valuables. Ransacking houses was another vile practice the inhabitants of this region endured, a barbarity without limits, and though it lasted for more than 2 days, its consequences were eternal. The unmistakable reality, the numbers of horror. The mayor of Esperia, a town in the province of Frosinone, reported that in his city, 700 women out of a total population of 2,500 were raped, with some having died as a result of the treatment they received. Throughout the events in the entire affected area, more than 7,000 civilians, including children, were raped by members of the Goumiers Corps. The number of men killed is estimated at 800. It is believed that the event known as Marocchinate was a massacre that claimed around 200,000 victims. The horror in that area was shocking, and no justice was ever served. We are talking about a dramatic chapter in the history of this nation, whose consequences are steeped in blood, tears, and unspeakable crimes. People of all ages were attacked, raped, tortured, and killed, with no one held accountable. It is known that there were 20,000 cases of rape, but this figure only includes those brave enough to report the abuse they suffered. However, this does not reflect the full reality, as many cases remained unreported, most in fact. and it is believed that this number rises to 60,000, according to specialist estimates. Several reports from health professionals at the time indicate that only 1/3 of the women who were violated in every manner managed to overcome their unwarranted shame and had the courage to report the crime. Subsequent reports revealed that many women, both older and young, suffered abuse repeatedly and at the hands of multiple attackers. There are even accounts of broken teeth to prevent biting during the assault. There were also cases of impalement and castration. The victims were mostly men who tried to defend their daughters, wives, sisters, or mothers, as no one was safe from the brutal and horrific attack. It was also discovered that several mutilations were carried out by Allied soldiers purely for amusement, using their notorious daggers. The ruthless and cruel nature of the sexual violence committed by the Allied troops is corroborated in recovered medical records. These documents provide written evidence that is deeply disturbing to any sensitive reader. A significant issue was the outbreak of infections such as syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted diseases, adding another layer of suffering for the populations and causing hundreds of terrible deaths. Only the use of American penicillin saved these areas from an epidemic. Thousands of young women became pregnant, and many clandestine abortions were carried out as a reaction to this brutality and as a way to erase evidence of the trauma they suffered. At the end of the war in September 1945, many children born as a result of these rapes were sent to the orphanage in Veroli for adoption. It is estimated that around 400 children were involved. These unwanted beings, products of blood-stained, horrific and terrifying unions, carry the weight of these traumas. How can these individuals project their lives when they learn of their past? It is merely the continuation of the anguish. The archived documents make it clear that white French soldiers also participated in this excessive violence, and it was not only the African soldiers in the French army who were responsible. It was not an ethnic issue, as some would have the public believe, attempting to shift the blame outward. If native French soldiers represented approximately 40% of the combat force, it is very odd to attribute responsibility solely to the colonial troops. It is evident that when the general authorized them to do as they pleased without consequences, he was speaking to the entire force, not just the colonial soldiers. France, as a nation, has historically denied responsibility for what occurred. Whenever the issue is brought up, the narrative suggests that it was the behavior of a segment of its troops rather than a widespread issue. Moreover, this narrative is inherently racist and discriminatory, as it fails to acknowledge that it was General Juin, a man of European blood who urged the troops to unleash the chaos. A British document reveals that French soldiers with no ties to Morocco or any other African nation raped an untold number of girls, including both young and adult women, and even young girls in public spaces. The same report confirms that they sodomized thousands of prisoners and castrated those they considered community leaders. This demonstrates the complete indifference and complicity of French officers, who seem to have participated in the massacres and remained silent about these atrocious acts. War crimes, the silence and impunity that endure. At the time, the International Red Cross offered its assistance to the Italian government, but it vehemently refused in order to avoid straining relations with France and to prevent a larger international conflict. Due to these actions, a veil of silence was cast over the events at Monte Cassino by both the perpetrators and the victims' government. Their high commands ignored the issue, no accusations were made, and there was no dissent within military ranks. Ultimately, nothing came of it. In this uncontrolled context, which took place in isolated mountainous towns during a global conflict, it is difficult to determine the exact number of deaths and cases of abuse. Likely, tens of thousands were affected by these sexual attacks that showed no regard for gender or age. From this, it is also complex to know how many people, as a result of the psychological and emotional trauma inflicted by this violence, were unable to resume their lives normally. Many of them abandoned their studies and faced difficulties in forming or maintaining relationships or starting families. Some even took their own lives or became clinically insane. Not only is the damage irreparable, but its consequences are as well, extending through generations of destroyed families and human lives. In the Italian parliament, there was a bill proposed in 1996 that set the number of victims of this terrible wave of rapes and sexual assaults at over 2,000 women aged between 11 and 86 years and 600 men. However, there are reasons to believe this number is very conservative, as it only accounts for clearly documented cases. British reports stated that young girls and elderly women were violated in public view, alongside numerous prisoners subjected to various forms of sexual assault, with the sole purpose of degrading and humiliating them, often in front of their families to heighten the sadism. The same reports noted that every single woman in the towns of Patrica, Pofi, Isoleta, Supino and Marolo was sexually assaulted. In Lanola, on the 21st of May, 50 young women were raped. When there were not enough women for everyone, girls and elderly women were also attacked. Secret military reports document these abuses, recording one of the worst episodes of this terrible war. The other side of a coin no less terrible than war itself is the horror within the horror. Even animals, according to these reports, were targeted in their sexual attacks. The methodology employed by the combatants is fully detailed in these documents. They describe the modus operandi of many of these aggressors. If the door of a house was locked, they would break it down, and upon finding someone inside, they would knock them unconscious with the butt of their weapon. The person would then be dragged outside, near the house, and raped in front of their family, husband or wife. The courage of the victims, chilling accounts of savage abuses. Over time, victims have found the courage to speak out and provide more information about this brutal event, this unbearable experience that left them permanently scarred. This act of bravery comes with a heavy burden, not only because testifying forced them to relive those horrific events, but also because it exposed them to public shame and condemnation. One woman reported witnessing how some Allied soldiers spotted a girl wearing elegant earrings. One of the soldiers approached and ripped them off her ears with his bare hands without hesitation. The witness detailed the screams of pain the victim emitted during that savage scene. Another witness was shocked to find her younger sister sitting with her head between her legs, completely still. As she approached, she noticed a trickle of blood running down her sister's legs to her feet. In a clear example of the pressure women face to remain silent about these abuses, when the older sister asked their mother what was wrong with her sibling, the mother simply told her not to bother her sister, saying she had just hurt herself. It was only much later that she understood what had really happened to her poor sister. A group of women who refused to be assaulted were attacked as a mob. First, the assailants fired shots into the air to intimidate them. Then they began separating them to assault them in smaller groups. They had no way to defend themselves. Those who tried to resist such attacks, whether neighbors or family members, suffered the consequences. Many were impaled with sharpened rods or stakes as a form of torture and execution, and they died as a result. A father who attempted to defend his daughter atop a mountain was beaten to death. There are chilling accounts of the cold-bloodedness of these individuals who felt no remorse. One witness recalls that a soldier entered her home while another waited outside. Her father went out and asked what was happening, to which the soldier outside responded with a shot that killed him instantly. Some believe the Italian government must collect all the testimonies and evidence to take action against France, demanding full responsibility and reparations. Surprisingly, many witnesses to these terrible and violent acts are still alive. After so many years, seeking action from the military prosecutor is no longer a utopian idea. Institutions now have the means to pursue the truth. On the 18th of June 1944, Pope Pius XII urged Charles de Gaulle to take action. A year later, French courts had prosecuted 300 Moroccans for the events in Italy, though the outcomes did not meet the expectations of the outraged international community. It was not until the 26th of November 2004 that the president of an association of Moroccan veterans, Ahmed Ben Rahalate, officially apologized for what happened at Monte Cassino. The French government has never done so. The terror of war generates anguish and tension among both combatants and the local population. However, no level of stress can justify using the female body as an object for the basest passions. Sexual violence cannot be seen as a catharsis for the experiences faced on the battlefield. The crimes at Monte Cassino could have been prevented, but the Allied military commanders not only failed to do so, but actively encouraged it. Many have tried in vain to find an explanation for such pain, but it is clear that nothing can justify what happened, not even the horror of war itself. It was a criminal act, an uncontrolled and savage violence inflicted by a group of soldiers who were given permission to do as they pleased without paying any price for their merciless acts, which caused so much harm. What is even more unforgivable is that throughout history, the governments involved have never offered an apology to the victims, who are left with only their voices to tell their story and prevent it from happening again.